Good afternoon, good morning, or evening, depending on where you are joining us today. Welcome to the second installment of our 2025 fall webinar series, The Sand Creek Massacre Remembered, Truth-Telling as a Path to Healing. My name is Amy Hong, and I serve as Assistant General Secretary of Programs at the General Board of Church and Society in Washington, D.C., which is housed in the United Methodist Building. The United Methodist Building is located in Washington, D.C., on the ancestral homelands of the Anacostan people who lived for generations neighboring the Piscataway and the Pamunkey people. We gratefully acknowledge the Native peoples on whose ancestral homelands that we gather and the diverse Native communities who make their home here today. As we continue this webinar, for participants who are blind, low vision, or perhaps are only listening, I am a Korean American woman with black hair tied back, wearing a light blue shirt, sitting in front of a sage green background. As shared during the first webinar of this series, it was in the early morning hours of November 29, 1864, the 3rd Colorado Cavalry, made up of 675 men under the command of Colonel John Shivington, a Methodist minister and political opportunist, attacked a peaceful Cheyenne and Arapaho encampment in the bend of Big Sand Creek, located in the southeastern Colorado Territory. The attack lasted for 8 hours, resulting in the deaths of approximately 230 Cheyenne and Arapaho people, most of whom were women, children, and the elders. The United Methodist Book of Resolution number 4263 responds to the Sand Creek Massacre, states, "We acknowledge that too often in the past and yet today, Christian individuals and the church as an institution have been agents of death rather than the protectors of life. Clergy and lay leaders who were trained, respected, honored by the Methodist Episcopal Church use their influence through the church, the government, and the military in ways that cause profound harm to Indian people at Sand Creek, including killing nearly 230 peaceful Indians camped under the protection of the U.S. government and desecrating the bodies of the slain. We acknowledge that leading up to the massacre, during the massacre, and in the aftermath of the massacre, representatives of the church utterly failed to uphold gospel values of respect for human life. As spiritual descendants, we are called to continue the journey of truth-telling, repentance, and healing in relationship with the descendants of the Sand Creek Massacre. This webinar series, along with the Sand Creek Massacre exhibit currently at the United Methodist Building, is part of that work of journeying of truth-telling, repentance, and healing. A short overview of our time together. After the presentation, there will be a time of question and answer, and so please enter your questions in the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen. So today, I am truly honored to introduce you to our speaker for today. Reverend Dr. Nancy Niero graduated with her Doctor of Ministry degree in May of 2023 from Phillips Theological Seminary in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Her thesis explored white silence in the United Church of Christ in the UCC Rocky Mountain Conference, to dismantle using storytelling of white 19th century ancestors of faith and resistance of those who stood up, spoke up with people of color. She received her Master of Divinity degree from Iliff School of Theology in Denver, Colorado in 2009. She is ordained in the United Church of Christ. Dr. Niero has a 15-year career in hospice and hospital chaplaincy bereavement. And prior to her call to ministry, she was a historic preservationist and a journalist. Her work has been greatly influenced by many great thinkers, including Reverend Dr. James Cone, Reverend Mark Charles, Dr. Vincent Harding, Bell Hooks, Ibram X. Kendi, Dr. Sun Chan Ra, Clint Smith, and others. Thank you so much for being with us today, Reverend Nancy. We are so excited for your presentation.
Oh, thank you so much, Amy, for that kind and generous introduction. And thank you so much for selecting witness as this year's Pages for Progress fall cohort. I'm so grateful to you and so grateful for all the doors you are opening in this conversation today, and grateful for our collaboration into the future, I hope. I also want to thank the Mountain Sky Conference of the United Methodist Church, and specifically Reverend Betty Nguyen, who has also opened many doors for me within the United Methodist Church. And I am forever grateful to her and her commitment to telling this story of the Sand Creek Massacre as well. My book is a collection of 25 letters that Kansas abolitionist Silas Soule wrote between 1860 and 1865. He writes from snowy Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, from Boston, where he met poet Walt Whitman, from the goldfields of Gilpin County that he fell in love with in the Colorado Territory, from Fort Union and Fort Craig in New Mexico, in the San Luis Valley in Colorado at Fort Garland, and finally at Fort Lyon in southeastern Colorado. I will be reading the last 3 letters in the collection, written in incredible detail about the violence and mutilation Silas saw at the massacre. These letters also include words that are inappropriate in the 21st century, but I will not be editing them. These letters are hard to hear. They are hard to speak. So please take care of yourself as you need to. But if we are to talk about truth-telling at the Sand Creek Massacre, then one needs to tell the truth. And in Silas's letters, we hear the details of that horrific day. Without hearing these letters, there can be no truth-telling, accountability, lament, healing, or even hope. We learn through these letters of a man who longs to get himself back home and have a small place on the farm outside of Lawrence, Kansas. He hopes to marry. He travels with a tight brotherhood of men in Kansas on the Underground Railroad, helping to escort formerly enslaved people to freedom. He travels with another tight brotherhood with soldiers he marches with on the Great March in 1862 from Denver to Fort Union, singing Yankee Doodle, the Star-Spangled Banner, and the Red, White, and Blue to fight Confederates in the hills near Pecos, New Mexico, at the Battle of Glorieta Pass. This child of abolitionists from New England, this Congregationalist son of Maine, he finds himself at Fort Lyon the summer of 1864, where I begin at this isolated fort on the plains and prairies, where he finds himself with experienced, well-trained soldiers by the likes of Ned Wynkoop, Joe Kramer, and Samuel Tappan. Because this is where the truth-telling begins. Southern Cheyenne George Bent and son of trader William Bent, an Owl woman, a Cheyenne woman, writes in a letter late in August 1864, while the young men were still busy raiding on the Platte, the chiefs called a council. Most of the older men in our camp were in favor of peace, although the young men were still raiding, and at this council, it was decided to write to the authorities, ask for peace, and offer to give up the white prisoners who had been captured during the raids. One of those letters that George Bent refers to went to Major Ned Wynkoop at Fort Lyon. In September, Ned rode with 127 men from the fort, including Silas, and met with Chief Black Kettle and other chiefs on the Smoky Hill River. This first conversation was Ned asking them to give up the white prisoners in their possession. The chiefs responded with they were desirous of making peace with the whites. Ned says he doesn't have the power to make peace, but if they could give up the white prisoners, he would escort the chiefs to Denver before the governor, and he pledged that he would protect them to Denver and back. In his congressional inquiry testimony, Silas said that Black Kettle, their principal chief, said the white prisoners were some distance from their camp and wanted to move 1 or 2 days march nearer to Fort Lyon. and wait there 2 days, and he would bring the white prisoners to us. They brought a white woman into our camp the same day, and the second day they brought in 3 children. Again, from his testimony at the congressional inquiry, Silas said that they went to Fort Lyon with about 50 of their Indians, and from there to Denver with 7 Indians and the captives. From his testimony, Silas said that Major Wynkoop asked the governor, Colonel Shivington, and some others to meet in council at Camp Weld to hear their propositions for peace. They had a talk with the chiefs. The Indians seemed very anxious to make peace. The governor told them that he could not make peace with them. They must look to the military power for protection. Colonel Shivington told them that he left the matter with Major Wynkoop. If they wanted peace, they must come into the post and subject themselves to military law. They all returned to Fort Lyon, where Major Wynkoop told them to bring in the Indians of their tribe who were anxious for peace to Fort Lyon and camp near the post, and he would immediately send to General Curtis and see if peace could not be made. And the Indians came in and complied with Wynkoop's orders and camped near the post, said Silas in his testimony. This is also truth, the trust that was developing between Ned and the chiefs, the safety promise of getting to Denver and returning, the assurance to camp at Fort Lyon, the missive sent to General Curtis for approval of this peace plan. George Bent wrote that when Black Kettle and the other chiefs returned from Denver, he heard that it was Evans who put the negotiations in the hands of Colonel Shivington. He writes that the chiefs remained puzzled by what Shivington had said and could not make out clearly what his intentions were. George Bent writes, the truth, probably, was that he had already laid his plans for the attack on our camp, which he carried out with such terrible effect a few weeks later. So in his talk, he said nothing to alarm the chiefs or to disturb their belief that peace was soon to be concluded, and added that Shivington was careful, however, to make no promises. In this groundwork that I've just illustrated for you through this correspondence and testimony, I add here that Ned made promises, though. He told the Cheyenne and Arapaho chiefs to bring their people to the post, and they did. Eventually, 106 lodges came to the post. Silas wrote in October to his sister Annie, "We have had considerable trouble with the Indians this summer, but they are quite peaceable at present. There are about 3,000 here within a mile of the post who have come in for the purpose of making peace. I do not know what we shall do, but I think the government will not make peace with them. If that is the case, we shall have some fighting to do this winter." And finally, George Bent writes that Major Wynkoop had reassured the chiefs, telling them that it was all right, and they might bring their bands in near the fort and camp there until the answer to their peace proposal was received. So the Cheyenne broke camp on the Smoky Hill and moved to Sand Creek, about 40 miles northeast of Fort Lyon. From this new camp, the Cheyenne went in and visited Major Wynkoop, and the people at the fort seemed so friendly that after a short time, the Arapaho left us and moved right down to the fort, where they went in camp and received regular rations. I share these events of August, September, and October of 1864 as markers of peacemaking at Fort Lyon. Peace as safety, peace of providing food, peace as an invitation for the Cheyenne and Arapaho to camp near the post. There are signs of hospitality, welcome, and kindness. Peace as kindness, peace as welcoming. No word ever came from General Curtis. By mid-November, Ned is removed from command at Fort Lyon and reassigned to Fort Riley, Kansas. A shocked and surprised Silas comes upon John Shivington and the 600 new, poorly trained, with no experience recruits from Denver in the dark of night, camped outside of Fort Lyon on November 27th. He tried to stop the massacre from happening. He disobeys orders to engage in it. He doesn't let the men under his command engage either. He witnesses the massacre not a mile away on his horse, but crossing over the Sandy Creek multiple times in the thick of the massacre. He watches 230 Cheyenne and Arapaho elders, women, and children horrifically murdered and mutilated by Colorado soldiers under the command of a Methodist minister. Here is the letter Silas wrote to Ned, followed by the last two letters he writes to his mom. December 14th, 1864, Fort Lyon, Colorado Territory. Dear Ned, 2 days after you left here, the 3rd Regiment with a battalion of the 1st arrived here, having moved so secretly that we were not aware of their approach until they had pickets around the post, allowing no one to pass out. They arrested Captain Bent and John Vogel and placed guards around their houses. They then declared their intention to massacre the friendly Indians camped on Sand Creek. Major Anthony gave all information and eagerly joined in with Shivington and company and ordered Lieutenant Kramer with his whole company to join the command. As soon as I knew of their movement, I was indignant, as you would have been were you here, and went to Cannon's room where a number of officers of the 1st and the 3rd were congregated, and told them that any man who would take part in the murders, knowing the circumstances as we did, was a low-lived, cowardly son of a bitch. Captain J.J. Johnson and Lieutenant Harding went to camp and reported to Shiv, Downing, and the whole outfit what I had said, and you can bet hell was to pay in camp. Shiv and all hands swore they would hang me before they moved camp, but I stuck it out, and all the officers at the post except Anthony backed me. I was then ordered with my whole company to Major A with 20 days' rations. I told him I would not take part in their intended murder, but if they were going after the Sioux, Kiowas, or any fighting Indians, I would go as far as any of them. They said that was what they were going for, and I joined them. We arrived at Black Kettle and Left Hand's camp at daylight. Lieutenant Wilson and companies C, E, and G were ordered in advance to cut off their herd. He made a circle to the rear and formed a line 200 yards from the village and opened fire. Poor old John Smith and Louderback ran out with white flags, but they paid no attention to them, and they ran back to their tents. Anthony then rushed up with companies D, K, and G to within 100 yards and commenced firing. I refused to fire and swore that none but a coward would, for by this time hundreds of women and children were coming toward us and getting on their knees for mercy. Anthony shouted, "Kill the sons of bitches." Smith and Louderback came to our command, although I am confident there were 200 shots fired at them. For I heard an officer say that old Smith and anyone who sympathized with the Indians ought to be killed, and now was a good time to do it. The battery then came up in our rear and opened on them. I took my company across the creek, and by this time the whole of the 3rd and the batteries were firing into them, and you can form some idea of the slaughter. When the Indians found there was no hope for them, they went for the creek and got under the banks, and some of the bucks got their bows and a few rifles and defended themselves as well as they could. By this time, there was no organization among our troops. They were a perfect mob, every man on his own hook. My company was the only one that kept their formation, and we did not fire a shot. The massacre lasted 6 or 8 hours, and a good many Indians escaped. I tell you, Ned, it was hard to see little children on their knees have their brains beat out by men professing to be civilized. One squaw was wounded, and a fellow took a hatchet to finish her. She held her arms up to defend her, and he cut one arm off and held the other with one hand and dashed the hatchet through her brain. One squaw with her 2 children were on their knees begging for their lives of a dozen soldiers within 10 feet of them, all firing, when one succeeded in hitting the squaw in the thigh, when she took a knife and cut the throats of both children and then killed herself. One old squaw hung herself in the lodge. There was not enough room for her to hang, and she held up her knees and choked herself to death. Some tried to escape on the prairie, but most of them were run down by horsemen. I saw 2 Indians hold one of another's hands, chased until they were exhausted, when they kneeled down and clasped each other around the neck, and both were shot together. They were all scalped, and as high as half a dozen taken from one head. They were all horribly mutilated. One woman was cut open and a child taken out of her and scalped. White Antelope, War Bonnet, and a number of others had ears and privates cut off. Squaws' snatches were cut out for trophies. You would think it impossible for white men to butcher and mutilate human beings as they did there. But every word I have told you is the truth, which they do not deny. It was also impossible to save any of them. Charlie Audeby saved John Smith and Windsor's squaw. I saved little Charlie Bent. George Bent was killed. Jack Smith was taken prisoner and murdered the next day in his tent by one of Dunn's Company E. I understand the man received a horse for doing the job. They were going to murder Charlie Bent, but I run him into the fort. They were going to kill old Uncle John Smith, but Lieutenant Cannon and the boys of Fort Lyon interfered and saved him. They would have murdered old Bent's family if Colonel Tappan had not taken the matter in hand. Kramer went up with 20 men, and they did not like to buck against so many of the first. Shivington has gone to Washington to be made general, I suppose, and get authority to raise a 9-month regiment to hunt Indians. He said Downing will have me cashiered if possible. If they do, I want you to help me. I think they will try the same for Kramer, for he has shot his mouth off a good deal and did not shoot his pistol off in the massacre. Joe has behaved first rate during this whole affair. Shivington reports 500 or 600 killed, but there were not more than 200. About 140 women and children and 60 bucks. A good many were out hunting buffalo. Our best Indians were killed. Black Kettle, One Eye, Minimic, and Left Hand. George Pierce of Company F was killed trying to save John Smith. There was one other of the first killed and 9 of the third, all through their own fault. They would get up to the edge of the bank and look over to get a shot at an Indian under them. When the women were killed, the bucks did not seem to try and get away, but fought desperately. Charlie Otterby wished me to write all about it to you. He says he would have given anything if you could have been here. I suppose Kramer has written to you all the particulars, so I will write half. Your family is well. Billy Wilker, Colonel Tappan, Wilson start for Denver in the morning. There is not news I can think of. I expect we will all have a hell of a time this with Indians this winter. We have 200 men at the post. Anthony in command. I think he will be dismissed when the facts are known in Washington. Give my regards to any friends you come across and write as soon as possible. Yours, SS. Signed SS Soule. And let's just take a couple of seconds just to sit with what we've just heard. December 18th, 1864, Fort Lyon, Colorado Territory. Dear Mother, I received a letter from you tonight, and you bet I was glad to hear from you. I ought to write oftener, but I am so lazy and have so little that would interest you that I neglect to write. I wrote to Annie and sent the letter by Mr. Gould, who belongs in Brunswick, I believe. He has served 3 years in my regiment, is going to Bath. You will see him, and he will tell you everything you want to know. I've not received any letter from Will since he left Lawrence. I think I'll write to him in the morning, although I don't believe he will receive it. The mails are so irregular. I receive letters from Annie and Em quite often and endeavor to answer them as soon as possible. I still have hopes of going to Maine this winter, but may not until spring. We've had considerable trouble with Indians this fall. The day you wrote, I was present at a massacre of 300 Indians, mostly women and children. It was a horrible scene, and I would not let my company fire. They were friendly, and some of our soldiers were in their camp at the time trading. It looked too hard for me to see little children on their knees begging for their lives, have their brains beat out like dogs. It was a regiment of 100 days men who accomplished the noble deed. Some of the Indians fought when they had no chance of escape and killed 12 and wounded 40 of our men. I had 1 horse shot. I have been an Indian scout for the last 3 weeks, but don't think we'll have much more at present. Tell Annie and Em that I'm just beginning to receive papers from them, for which I am very grateful. Give my love to everybody and tell them that I would be glad to hear from them. I do not write near as often as I used to, for I have so much to do to keep my company papers correct. I'm responsible for $50,000 worth of government property, which must be attended to. I will write occasionally. Don't get worried, for there is not the least danger in the world of my getting killed, and as I am the most interested party, you should not fret. I believe I will write a letter to Uncle Ben. Good night, your Sonny, Silas. And the last letter in this collection, January 8th, 1865, Fort Lyon, Colorado Territory. Dear Mother, I suppose you are anxious to hear from me. I should have written oftener if I had not been so busy fixing up my papers. Our regiment has been mustered out, 3 years having expired, and all the officers are relieved from duty at this point. And I, amongst the rest, want to get my papers all square. So if I go out, I can start for the States right off. But the officers think that I will be retained in the Veterans Organization. At any rate, I can if I wish, and I have been thinking about the matter over and believe it is best. For if I go back, I don't know of anything I could do at that would pay, for I am too lazy to work, you well know. The only chance would be to marry a rich widow. Do you think there is a good chance in Maine, or will I find a richer ones out west? I had applied for a leave of absence to go to Maine and just received answer from it saying that our regiment was to be immediately reorganized. So we will have to wait. I may not see you before March. I suppose you have seen Mr. Gould. I sent a letter by him. He will tell you all about killing Indians. I spent New Year's Day on the battleground counting dead Indians. There were not as many killed as was reported. There was not more than 130 killed, but most of them were women and children, and all of them scalped. I hope the authorities at Washington will investigate the killing of those Indians. I think they will be apt to hoist some of our officials. I would not fire on the Indians with my company, and the colonel said he would have me cashiered, but he is out of service before me, and I think I stand better than he does in regard to his great Indian fight. I am reforming in regard to my bad habits, mother, for I have left off chewing tobacco and smoking a pipe, but I will smoke cigars when I can get them. I don't drink, so you see I'm getting quite respectable and will stand a chance of getting a wife when I go down east. I'm going to write Will this evening. I have not written since he went south. I wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Wish I could send you a present, but our paymaster died Christmas, and we have had no pay for 4 months. I am almost broke. Your affectionate son, Silas. Silas was assassinated in the streets of Denver on the evening of April 23rd, 1865, drawn out of his home from shots fired to lure him to 15th and Arapahoe streets for speaking his truth. There is much to be broken about telling and hearing about the Sand Creek Massacre and where we find ourselves at this place there on that day on the rolling hills near the cottonwood trees in the Sandy Creek. Do we find ourselves as Christians, clergy, as a veteran, a soldier, a disobeyer, a follower? Once we know what is broken, then healing can begin. What did you lose that day? What grief do you hold? What broke you? Reading those letters out loud is the truth telling we have to hear, to lament. Without them, we have no idea how horrific was. Without them, we don't know the depth of how much lament we must find in our own bodies to move to what healing might be. For it is this beginning accountable to the horrors and historical racial injustice that we as a confessional church find ourselves. Only if we are able to lament and admit to that devastation of that day can we discover healing. For me, this accountability is the storytelling and naming the violence and mutilation by those Colorado soldiers. It includes that a Methodist minister was in command, that a Methodist governor helped orchestrate it. There were hundreds of soldiers who went along with the orders. Only 2 said no. Accountable is where you and I find ourselves in this truth-telling. Theologian Soong Chan Ra writes that lament recounts historical suffering. It stems from an acute experience of pain, be it physical, emotional, or spiritual. Lament is honesty before God and each other, writes Ra. So in this relationship between accountability and lament and healing, I also invite us to name the grief here, the loss here, to name the grief and loss we feel is also of lament. When we gather at Silas's grave every October at the spiritual healing run in a ceremony that is led by Cheyenne and Arapaho descendants, we are all doing the work of lament together. The people gathered are offered the smoke and cedar and sweetgrass. The drummers sing a veteran's song. Silas descendant Byron Strom reads the letter to Ned. For the young first-time readers, this may be the first time that they have heard these words spoken out loud of the horrific violence upon their relatives that day along the Sandy Creek. Lament work and healing will take place this November 29th, next week, with those gathered to listen to Sand Creek Massacre descendants at a candlelight vigil on the anniversary of the Sand Creek Massacre outside at the Central Library in Denver. Lament work happens when community gathers in the new truth-telling places of the new United Methodist responses to the Sand Creek Massacre team that is committed to the ongoing work of reconciliation in the United Methodist Church and Arapaho Sand Creek descendants. I want to just give you 2 examples of how I have experienced healing since the book came out this summer. I was in conversation this last week with a descendant of an ancestor who was given or purchased an arrow, a ladle, the remains of a cradle board cover, and human remains stolen from the Sand Creek Massacre site. Here is what she wrote to me this month in a reflection that she shared about repatriating those artifacts and human remains in 2017 to the Cheyenne and Arapaho people. She met Sand Creek Massacre descendants who led a ceremony and blessed her. She wrote that she could still feel the touch of the eagle feather on her cheek. There were prayers spoken by the Cheyenne and Arapaho who later expressed gratitude to her family for the return of these objects and remains. She wrote to me and said, "They showed us nothing but love." And then in the question and answers of a book reading I did at Fort Garland last summer, one of the people in the audience, a historical interpreter, talked for a bit about the massacre from an intellectual reflection, intellectualizing the movement of the soldiers and such. This young man came, not a young man, this man came up to me with his book that he had just bought. And he leaned into me and said, "Thank you for writing this book." And he looked at the interpreter who had spoken about intellectualizing the massacre and looked back at me and said, "I'm a Vietnam veteran, and he knows nothing of war." I thanked him for his service and left that night about the lived experience of soldiers who have fought at wars and how this truth-telling connects with veterans today about moral injury, moral courage, what is right, what is wrong, and healing. The rituals that we create for ourselves around blessings and ceremonies and gatherings where we come together in community are necessary, in fact, vital for how healing happens and how we move forward into the future. Rituals are the seeds of lament and healing when we gather in our faith communities. I invite us all to create new liturgies, prayers, and worship experiences where the faithful gather to lament together this day in November 29th, 1864. And I ask that we just not do this once, that this is justice work that we need to gather around always, returning to this anniversary every year with lament and communal grief, for that is how healing will be found. Dr. Rita Nakashima Brock describes the passages of the three letters that I read as Silas's repair work. Brock, who is the national expert on moral injury, and it describes that moral injury is not a set of symptoms and it's not a disease. It's a way of how people figure out how to live in a way that doesn't collapse you. Many, many, many veterans historically have suffered from moral injury, watching others that they have come to trust and serve with do unspeakable acts of violence as well. He tried to stop the massacre the night before and failed. And Dr. Brock says he knew what was going to happen was wrong. Then not being able to stop it because he failed to prevent it is a sense of moral responsibility. His determination to write these letters is that Silas was willing to take a risk to make it known as sense of moral courage. Where is your moral courage in this storytelling? And how are you committed to repair work? Moral outrage is really another word for accountability. Repair work is really another word for healing. Healing comes in a lot of different places in a lot of different ways. And one of the places that I'd invite you to discern in your lives is going to visit the massacre site in southeastern Colorado National Park Service location on a pilgrimage. Walk it. Sit at the bench at the repatriation site. Breathe in the sacred space of stillness and quiet and find yourself there at this massacre site that for descendants is very much a presence of today. Finally, I want to conclude my lecture with this communal invitation and really a blessing that if you have artifacts and human remains in your closets, safety deposit boxes, or attics that were stolen at the Sand Creek Massacre that have been given to you, passed down as an inheritance, now is the time to repatriate these sacred objects back to Cheyenne and Arapaho descendants. They are not yours. There is no shame in returning them, but only healing in the letting go of them, and quite possibly even peacemaking with your ancestors for choices he made more than 160 years ago. Thank you again for inviting me to the table today. Amen.
Thank you so much, Reverend Nancy. Sometimes having read the letters is one thing, but having it being read by another person that can listen to it was, I really appreciated it and kind of also reminds me of how human he was. Um, and, and I also appreciate that as well. A few questions in the Q&A. First, when and how were Silas's letter discovered? Were
Hmm.
they preserved in a place somewhere? And what drew you to Silas?
Oh, that's a whole other hour, but I'll try and condense this. His letters, and I just actually made this parallel this week about the this woman who I was in conversation with, who his family handed down these uh sacred objects and human remains in an inheritance. Those objects were cared for by women in her family and preserved and cared for as well. These letters were preserved and cared for women in Silas's family as well. And not just letters, there's a photo album. There are diaries from Silas's mom, Sophia. Um, and so these were all handed down through generations in Silas's family. I mentioned Byron Strom, who I worked closely with around this collection of letters, publishing them because he is the owner of them today. And his parents, Milton and Edith Strom, in the 1960s, and his Aunt Anne, Byron's Aunt Anne, all were communicating with Dr. Raymond Carey, a beloved history professor at the University of Denver. And last year I went through Dr. Carey's collection that had been given to the Special Collections Library there and saw correspondence around the exchange of sending the letters that they had from the family, letters that are to his sister Annie and sister Emily, or M, and his mom. And then there are other letters that are part of the family collection that after he was assassinated, I think family friends brought letters that they had had from Silas that are part of this familial collection as well. And Dr. Carey then made those letters transcribed available. He shared them with the Colorado Historical Society and the Denver Public Library. And 15 years ago, when I started doing research, I had 4 independent studies at ILIF on Silas. I found those letters, the mimeographed copies there, not all of them, but many of them. And then I ordered his military records to from the National Archives, and that's where the correspondence from Shivington is, and his correspondence to others, and Ned and Major Anthony are all part of that. So a slow accumulation of them. And then I discovered a letter that I didn't have in my collection last year, which is the first the letter that is that's written from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, to his childhood friend George Cutter. So that's that answer to how did I find the letters. And what was the second part, Amy?
So, what drew you to Silas?
Hmm. I I discovered Silas totally. I think it's divine intervention these days, but on a portrait of him was hanging at the Colorado Historical Society, and I had just been hired as a museum educator in 1995 to care for the 5,000 young visitors that come to the museum every year and make sure they had great tours, and we had great trained volunteers, and so on my new employee tour, there was a portrait of him in the basement at 1300 Broadway. And I said, "Who is this?" And I knew he was a Civil War soldier just because I knew that uniform. And the guide said, "Oh, he's Silas Soule, and he was at the Sand Creek Massacre, but disobeyed orders and then wrote a letter and then was assassinated for speaking truth." And I tried to take every tour group of young children past his portrait every time I did a tour. And over time, he I left there and I went to work for the historic cemeteries in Denver, Fairmont, and Riverside as their historic preservationist. And I discovered in modern times where his grave was at Riverside Cemetery. And so I had a very dear friend at the time, Susie Aikman, who had a radio show in Denver on Native American music. She's a Cherokee woman. And she was very well connected to descendants, the Sand Creek Massacre descendants. And she told the world where he was. And then that year was the first year that the spiritual healing run that's led by Cheyenne and Arapaho people started at Riverside Cemetery, following the run from the massacre site through Eads up to Lyman. And so I kept along these stages thinking, well, that's that, you know, and then he just kept calling to me. And I got called to ministry. I did 4 independent studies, as I mentioned. I have had a career of 15 years as a hospice chaplain. And then I thought I wasn't going back to school. And then I was called back to school. And there he was in my doctoral program. So I journeyed with him for the last 30 years in many different ways. And I know his family so well. I feel like I know him so well. I have then I wrote this book. So it's been a unbelievable journey of 30 years as I look back on it.
So much for sharing that. Um, a few more questions, and this is more historical questions.
Um,
And so you read a letter by Silas regarding the Sand Creek Massacre. I believe it was the first letter that you read. And in that letter, there's a description of someone named Bent. Um, are they related to George? Yeah, it seems like he.
yes. Yes. George Bent. Um, and let me just also, since we're talking historical clarification here, George Bent was not killed at the Sand Creek Massacre, although Silas thought so. He was not. He ends up writing letters himself that are published in letters from George Bent. But George Bent was there. And there's places along the trail that you can meander at the massacre site that with great incredible signage help you point to the places where George Bent was that day. But he is the son of William and Owl Woman, and William Bent was the trader from St. Louis that started Bent's forts in southeastern Colorado. So there, and Charlie Bent was a brother of George Bent and also a son of William Bent and Owl Woman who was there. And that's Charlie Bent is the one that Silas is able to find and take back to the fort.
Thank you. And there's another question. Did Shivington know that the camp was not protected by the warriors?
Oh, well, let me just try and explain. Well, I'm not sure what warriors are, but so I'm just going to imagine what that might mean. But John John Shivington came knowing that there were thousands of Cheyenne and Arapaho people peacefully camped. And in fact, Silas, in an early letter that Gary Roberts, who's the Methodist author of an incredible book on the Sand Creek Massacre that was written on behalf of the for the United Methodist Church, writes that in that letter that Silas writes, he actually says to John Shivington, Cheyenne and Arapaho people are coming to the fort as part of, I think, just a declaration of what we have said to the Cheyenne and Arapaho people are being heard and they are coming. Well, so John Shivington knows that there are thousands of Cheyenne and Arapaho people gathering. And so this surprise, no one is informed that John Shivington is coming. It's a shock to discover them in the middle of the night on the 27th. And Silas is the one who comes upon him for the first time. And no mention, it is secretive. There is no mention of him or his arrival. So very quickly, the intention has come out, and then that in these conversations on the 28th, Silas says, essentially, I'm paraphrasing here, we can't do this. There have been promises of peace. There have been places where, we've told them to camp here peacefully. This is peace. And so in this wrestle, and I think that's one of the things that we find in how we try to figure out all of this in matter of hours. Let me just say that this is happening. This new awareness of what he's come to do, and then does, even though attempts are made to stop it. So the Sand Creek is was about 40 miles from Fort Lyon. So there is a distance. And then so on the morning of the 29th, they leave in the dark of night and show up at dawn.
So much. And because of time, this is actually going to be the last question, unfortunately.
Mm.
The question is, as someone who has studied the life and letters of Silas Soule, what can we learn today about speaking truth to power?
Mm.
And I preface this by saying that in some previous conversations with tribal representatives or the descendants of Sand Creek, they share that they tell and retell what happened so that it is not forgotten, but that a second part of it is so that it will not happen again. And so the question for you is, what can we learn from Silas for today?
Yeah. Yeah, that is something I ask of myself a lot. Uh, I think part of that answer is what we can find out about him today and what are his lessons for us, inspiration for us, is, having a voice and using a voice. In the world we live in today, I think there is so many places for us to speak up, show up, stand up with others, and just this place of how are we a witness in our world today? How do we find our voice, showing up, standing up, and how do we choose that rather than being silent? How do we choose? I'm going to show up at the Sand Creek Spiritual Healing Run ceremony at Riverside Cemetery next year. How do I show up for today's webinar? How do I show up in my own community? If I'm a Methodist, how do I show up about this story in my faith community? How do I continue to tell this story and finding our ways to tell other stories because we've been inspired to be a witness in our own world? And that's a huge invitation for how to be present in a tremendous amount of suffering today. How do we find our way to that, to be a witness? He showed up in so many places on the Underground Railroad, at Sand Creek in disobeyance, writing letters, giving testimony. He was there giving testimony for 6 days. How can we find our way and our voice to be a witness in our own world today is what I continue to travel with most every day myself.
Thank you so much for sharing and for giving all of us this challenge to show up.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Amy. I am so, so grateful to you and the office and for this incredible sacred time together. And I hope there's more of it. So you take care of
Definitely.
you.
Well, thank you so much. For all of you joining us today, today's webinar is the last webinar in this series. A follow-up email will be sent with the links to both of the webinars, this one and the one that happened earlier this week with Dr. Kelman, and with additional resources as well. Again, a sincere thank you and a gratitude to Reverend Nancy Niero for being with us today, and helping us continue on in this path of healing. And so we really appreciate it. And thank you all for joining us today and hope you all have a great rest of the week. Peace. Thank you. Bye.